Picture this: Constantinople, 1648. In the dead of night, hundreds of heavy sacks are quietly dropped from boats into the cold, dark waters of the Bosphorus. But these sacks aren't filled with smuggled goods or royal treasure. They are filled with the women of the Sultan's harem. This was the work of our subject Sultan Ibrahim I, the so-called shadow of God on earth. If you think our modern political scandals are wild, or you get anxious about the mental fitness of today's leaders, you need to hear this story. How does a man with absolute power, the leader of the world's most powerful empire, decide to, well, liquidate his entire household in a single night? What could possibly drive a man to that level of insane, self-defeating cruelty? That's the simple, shocking story. But here's our first mini-hook. The real key to Ibrahim's madness isn't what he did on the throne, but what was done to him before he got there, locked away in a gilded prison known as the cage. And our second hook, did the mass drowning even happen the way they say it did? Or was this the ultimate 17th century political smear campaign designed to justify taking out a leader who had become a liability, a paranoid ruler, a shadowy cabal, and a mystery that's shrouded in propaganda? This one gets messy. So what's your gut feeling? Was he a madman or was he framed? Let me know your initial theory in the comments. And just for fun, tell us where in the world you're tuning in from for this dive into historical insanity. Now let's get started. All right, so we have our central mystery, a sultan who allegedly decided to, let's say, downsize his household in the most permanent way imaginable. But to even begin to understand how a man could reach that point, we have to understand the truly bizarre and brutal world that created him. We need to set the stage. And our stage is the Topkapi Palace in Constantinople, the heart of the Ottoman Empire in the mid-17th century. Now, if you think American politics is a circus, you have no idea. This was the big leagues. The Ottoman Empire was at the time the most powerful state on earth, stretching from the gates of Vienna to the shores of the Persian Gulf. The Sultan wasn't just a king or a president, he was considered the caliph of all Islam, the shadow of God on earth. His power was, in theory, absolute. But to understand what's about to happen, you need to understand two key institutions that defined life at the top. Think of them as the rules of the game, and these rules were written in blood. The first is the imperial harem. Now get all the steamy, romanticized nonsense from movies out of your head. The harem wasn't just the Sultan's private collection of beautiful women, it was the absolute nerve center of political power. Think of it like the West Wing of the White House, but with way better interior decorating and a lot more backstabbing, literally. It was a vicious ecosystem where women, often slaves captured from across the empire, vied for influence. The ultimate prize wasn't just a night with the Sultan, it was to bear him a son, a prince, because the mother of a future Sultan became one of the most powerful people in the world. It was a game of chess where your children were the pieces and the board was the entire empire. And that brings us to the second rule of the game, the institution that is absolutely central to our story. It's a place called the Kafes, which literally means the cage. You see, the Ottomans had a recurring problem with succession. When a sultan died, his sons would often start a civil war to see who would take over. It was messy, expensive, and bad for business. So they came up with a solution. Instead of letting the princes run around starting armies, the new sultan would have all of his brothers and male relatives locked up. They were confined to a lavish, beautifully decorated set of rooms. Within the palace, a gilded prison. That was the Kafes. Now, we talk a lot today in the US about PTSD, about the deep psychological trauma that soldiers carry home from war. We understand that these experiences can fundamentally break and reshape a person's mind. The Kafes was a psychological torture chamber designed to do exactly that. Imagine spending your entire adult life from childhood onwards in a luxury apartment that you can never leave. You have servants, you have food, you have comfort. What you don't have is freedom or any certainty that you'll be alive tomorrow. Every single day you live with the quiet, creeping terror that the guards knocking on your door aren't there to bring you lunch, but to carry out your execution, a sentence that your own brother, the Sultan, could issue at any moment for any reason. This is the environment that created our main character. So let's meet the key players on our stage. First, we have the man himself, Prince Ibrahim. When our story begins, he isn't a sultan, he's an inmate. He has been locked inside the Kafes for 22 years. He's seen his brothers dragged out and executed one by one. He is, to put it mildly, not well. He is a man marinating in pure, unadulterated terror. Next, we have his big brother, the reigning monarch, Sultan Murad IV. Murad was everything Ibrahim was not. He was a ruthless, terrifying, and brutally effective ruler. He was a warrior sultan who personally led his armies, banned coffee and tobacco under penalty of death, and was known to stalk the streets of his capital in disguise, personally beheading anyone who broke his laws. He was a man who had executed several of his own brothers already, and he kept Ibrahim alive but locked away, a forgotten ghost haunting the halls of the palace. And finally, we have the most powerful player of all, the puppet master pulling the strings behind the curtain, their mother, the magnificent and terrifying Ottoman Sultan. Ottoman was a political genius. As the mother of multiple sultans, she had been the effective co-ruler and the true power in the empire for decades. Think of her as the ultimate Washington kingmaker, a matriarch of a political dynasty who understood power better than anyone. She had navigated the brutal politics of the harem and the court to place her sons on the throne, and she ruled through them. She was brilliant, she was ruthless, and she saw her sons as instruments of her own power. So you have the psycho brother on the throne, the traumatized brother in the cage, and the master political operator of a mother trying to manage them both. For years, this was the status quo. Murad ruled with an iron fist, and Ibrahim wasted away in the Kafes, his sanity fraying with each passing day, his only companions the deaf-mute servants assigned to him, and the constant screaming voice of fear in his own head. What, you have to wonder, does 22 years of that do to a person's soul? What kind of man emerges from a cage like that? Well, in 1640, the world was about to find out, because the impossible happened. Sultan Murad IV, the great terrifying warrior, fell ill and died. The throne was empty. The only surviving male heir to the entire Ottoman dynasty was the man in the cage. The king was dead, but the story was just beginning. They were about to swing open the doors to that cage, expecting to find a prince. They had no idea they were about to unleash a monster of their own creation. So the most powerful man in the Ottoman Empire, Sultan Murad IV, is dead. The throne is empty. And the only person left to fill it is his brother Ibrahim, a man who has spent the last 22 years locked in a gilded cage, waiting to be murdered. What happens next is less of a royal succession and more like a scene from a very, very dark comedy. The Grand Vizier and the palace officials, including Ibrahim's own mother, Ottoman Sultan, go to the Kafes to give him the good news. Hey, guess what? Your terrifying, murderous brother is dead. You're the Sultan now. You're free. And Ibrahim's response, pure, undiluted terror. He was absolutely convinced it was a trick. He had survived this long by trusting no one, and he wasn't about to start now. He barricaded the door and refused to come out. Think about that for a second. The most powerful men in the empire were on the other side of the door offering him the world, and he was huddled inside, certain they were there to kill him. He was like a long-term hostage who couldn't comprehend that the ordeal was finally over. It got so desperate that his mother, Ottoman, had to order the body of her dead son, Murad, to be brought to the door of the Kafes, just to prove to her living son that his nightmare was finally over. Only then, after seeing his brother's corpse with his own eyes, did Ibrahim cautiously emerge, blinking in the sunlight, a 25-year-old man with the terrified eyes of a child and the deep psychological scars of a man who had been to hell and back. He was dragged not triumphantly but tremblingly to the throne room and declared the new sultan. The cage door was open, and a mind that had been warped by 2 decades of isolation and fear was now in charge of an empire. Now, for the first few years of his reign, things were deceptively calm. Ibrahim was so deeply traumatized and so completely inexperienced with the outside world that he was little more than a figurehead. His formidable mother Kusum and the experienced Grand Vizier basically ran the country. They would hand him documents and he would sign them. He was for a while the perfect puppet. He just sat in the palace surrounded by a world he didn't understand, while the real professionals handled the business of the empire. But then slowly at first, and then with an all-consuming rush, Ibrahim discovered the two things he had been denied his entire life: pleasure and power. And having been starved for so long, he didn't just sip from the cup. He dove in head first and tried to drink the entire ocean. His mind, which had no framework for moderation or responsibility, fixated on the most extreme forms of self-indulgence. First, it was scents. He became obsessed with ambergris, an incredibly rare and expensive substance from whales used in perfumes. He wanted everything to smell of it. Then it was fur, specifically sable fur. He didn't just want a coat. He commanded that entire rooms in the palace be lined floor to ceiling with the pelts of Russian sable. His desire for fur was so absolute that it placed a massive strain on the imperial treasury. It was the 17th century equivalent of a tech billionaire deciding his entire house, including the bathrooms, needed to be wallpapered with $100 bills. It was a level of excess that screamed instability. And then his obsessions turned to the harem. For a man who had spent 22 years with virtually no female contact, the harem became his personal toy box, and he wanted to fill it with very specific kinds of toys. He developed an unusual and very particular appetite. He sent out agents across the entire empire with a very specific and very strange casting call. Ibrahim wanted his harem filled with the largest, heaviest women they could possibly find. It became a state-sponsored mission. Governors in distant provinces were tasked with finding candidates who fit the Sultan's unique preference. His favorite concubine, a woman he named Shekerpare, which means sugar cube, was said to have been so large that she had difficulty moving. He showered her with gifts and power, making her one of the most influential figures at court. It was a strange and public display of a private fetish, another sign that the Sultan's mind was operating on a completely different plane of reality from everyone else. These obsessions weren't cheap. The harem's expenses ballooned. The demand for sable ambergris jewels and lavish gifts for his favorites was draining the state coffers at an alarming rate. It's a story Americans are familiar with. A leader with no concept of fiscal responsibility, spending money like it's a renewable resource. Ibrahim was running an empire on a credit card with no limit, and the people who actually had to balance the budget were starting to sweat. His behavior grew more erratic. He would spend days playing games in the palace gardens. In a bizarre reversal of protocol, he would sometimes force the high-born women of his harem, including his own sisters and nieces, to act as handmaidens to his favorite concubines. He was a whirlwind of unpredictable whims. One day he was a giggling child, the next a paranoid tyrant. And this is where the story turns from a personal tragedy into a national crisis. The people in power, the viziers, the military commanders, and especially his mother Kusum, began to realize the puppet had cut his own strings and was now swinging wildly around the stage, setting fire to the curtains. He was no longer controllable. He was a liability. In politics, whether it's 17th century Constantinople or modern-day Washington, D.C., there is nothing more terrifying to the establishment than an unstable, unpredictable leader who won't listen to his advisors. Ibrahim's erratic behavior and catastrophic spending were weakening the empire. Enemies were noticing. The army was growing restless. Ottoman Sultan, the master strategist, saw the writing on the wall. The son she had placed on the throne to secure her own power was now threatening to bring the whole house down. He had to be dealt with. But you can't just fire the Sultan. You can't just vote him out of office. Deposing the shadow of God on earth is the nuclear option. You need a justification. You need a reason so compelling, so horrifying, that it makes the unthinkable not only possible but necessary. They needed a final straw. And according to the story that has echoed down through the centuries, Ibrahim, in his spiraling madness, was about to provide them with the most monstrous reason of all: evidence. All right, so the stage is set. We have a ruler who is spiraling out of control, a walking liability, wearing a crown. And we have a political establishment led by his own mother that has decided he needs to go. They just needed a reason, a monstrous act, to justify the unthinkable. And this brings us to the very heart of our story, the event that has defined Ibrahim's entire legacy in the blood-soaked pages of history. It's time to move beyond the narrative and enter the chamber of analysis. So let's put on our detective fedoras or maybe our lab coats for this one. It's time to perform a historical autopsy. But you have to understand this is an autopsy where the body has been missing for over 350 years. The crime scene is contaminated with centuries of propaganda, the witnesses are all long dead, and the original case file was almost certainly written by the killers themselves. The job of a historical detective is to sift through the lies to find a kernel of truth. The official story, the one you'll find in the darkest corners of history, is as simple as it is horrifying. One day, Ibrahim, in a fit of paranoid rage, perhaps because he heard a rumor that one of his concubines had been, let's say, compromised by an outsider, made a decision. He ordered his entire harem, all 280 women, to be bound in weighted sacks and thrown into the churning waters of the Bosphorus. A single insane act of mass murder. It's a story that paints him as an absolute monster, a cartoon villain. And if you're a group of plotters looking to justify a coup, it's the perfect story. But here in the Cursed Chambers, we question the official story. So let's open the case file and examine the evidence, or rather the lack of it. Exhibit A, the unreliable sources. The first rule of any investigation: consider your source. Where does this incredibly specific, incredibly damning story even come from? Well, it comes primarily from chronicles and ambassador reports written after Ibrahim was already overthrown and dead. This is a classic textbook case of the winners writing the history. It's the 17th century equivalent of a brutal political attack ad. Think about it. Does a modern political ad ever say, "My opponent is a reasonable person with slightly different ideas on fiscal policy"? No. It says, "My opponent eats puppies for breakfast and wants to burn down the economy." The story of the mass drowning serves the same purpose. It's not designed to be a factual account, it's designed for maximum emotional impact. The number itself, 280, is so perfectly, horrifically round. It's a headline number, a statistic, meant to shock you into submission to eliminate any shred of sympathy you might have for the man they were about to kill. It's entirely possible, even probable, that the real event was much smaller. Perhaps Ibrahim, in his paranoia, did execute a few members of his household, an act that was still brutal and tyrannical, but not the act of genocidal madness the story suggests. That smaller, uglier truth could have then been inflated by the new regime, blown up into a horrifying legend for public consumption. It was a political necessity. After all, history is filled with convenient truths. Exhibit B. The political motive, or as they say in detective stories, cui bono, who benefits? This is where the story starts to look less like the act of a madman and more like a cold, calculated political hit. The answer to who benefits is painfully obvious. His mother, Ottoman Sultan, and the powerful military and political officials around her. They were watching the CEO of Empire Incorporated run the company into the ground. He was a walking PR disaster, his personal spending was causing a fiscal crisis, and his erratic foreign policy was making the state vulnerable. In the cutthroat world of corporate politics or imperial politics, when the board loses faith in the CEO, they orchestrate a hostile takeover. And that's exactly what this was. But you need shareholder approval. You need to convince the public, the army, and the religious establishment. You can't just tell them, "We're overthrowing the Sultan because he's spending too much on fur and is difficult to work with in meetings." That doesn't get you a revolution. That gets you a civil war. But we are rising up to depose a monster who drowns hundreds of innocent women, a depraved creature who defiles the very name of Sultan. Now that is a story that sells. That is a story that unites the opposition and justifies the unthinkable. It transformed a treasonous power grab into a righteous crusade to save the soul of the empire. But even if the story was a brilliant piece of political propaganda, it only worked because people were willing to believe it. It had to be plausible. And it was plausible because of the one undeniable truth at the center of it all, the fact that Ibrahim's behavior had become terrifyingly unstable. And that brings us to the real heart of the matter, the exhibit that explains everything else. Exhibit C, the psychological profile. And this is where the story stops being a cynical political thriller and becomes a profound and deeply painful human tragedy. To understand what happened, we have to put aside the politics, put aside the rumors, and look at the man. And when we do that, we have to talk seriously and with empathy about trauma. Here in the 21st century in the United States, we have a name for it. We call it post-traumatic stress disorder. We see its devastating effects on soldiers who come home from the horrors of war, their minds forever rewired by what they've seen and endured. We see it in survivors of childhood abuse. We understand, or we are at least beginning to understand, that deep, prolonged trauma can shatter a person's soul. It can lead to hypervigilance, the feeling of being constantly on high alert. It can cause extreme paranoia, emotional numbness, explosive rage, and a desperate search for intense sensations just to feel anything at all. Now take that clinical understanding and apply it to Ibrahim. He didn't just have a one-year tour of duty in a war zone. He lived for 22 years from the time he was a boy until he was a man in a state of constant, imminent mortal threat. It wasn't just isolation. It was the sound of footsteps in the hall that could be your last. It was the taste of food you half suspected might be poisoned. It was the deaf-mute servants who were your only companions, their silence a constant screaming reminder of your own voicelessness, your own powerlessness. It was knowing that your own brother, the most powerful man in the world, could order your death on a whim, and no one could stop him. Before we judge Ibrahim as just another mad king, we have to ask ourselves a difficult question. If any one of us were subjected to that kind of sustained psychological torture for that long, how would we emerge? Would we be kind and stable and wise, or would we be a wreck of a human being lashing out at a world we never learned how to live in? Every single one of his mad behaviors can be seen as a tragic symptom of this profound trauma. His frantic spending, the obsession with piling up furs and jewels, it wasn't simple greed. It was the desperate, compulsive action of a man who had known nothing but emptiness, trying to build a physical fortress of things around a psychological void the size of an ocean. His bizarre and specific sexual demands. They weren't the actions of a confident playboy. They were the confused, desperate, and frankly pathetic fumblings of a man who never learned how to have a normal, healthy human relationship. He had been taught that power and control were the only forms of interaction, so that's what he sought in the most intimate parts of his life. The paranoia, the sudden violent rages, classic symptoms of hypervigilance. The reflexive lashing out of a mind that can never ever feel safe, a mind that sees threats in every shadow, because for 22 years the shadows were all he had. We have national conversations now about whether a president is mentally fit for office based on a slip of the tongue or a moment of confusion. What we are looking at with Ibrahim is not a minor cognitive decline. It is a full-blown psychological collapse happening on the world stage with the power of life and death in his hands. He was a man crying for help in the only language he had ever been taught, the language of absolute brutal power. And no one was listening. They didn't see a victim. They saw a political problem that needed to be solved. And that brings us to the real cursed chamber of this story. When we ask what the curse was, what truly doomed Sultan Ibrahim, the answer is devastatingly clear. The cursed chamber wasn't the harem where his women lived. The real cursed chamber was the Kafes, the gilded cage where the Ottoman state locked away its spare princes to keep them safe. The curse wasn't a demon or a whisper from hell. The curse was a political system so deeply paranoid, so terrified of civil war, that its solution was to systematically torture its own heirs. It chose to manufacture broken, traumatized men, and then in a moment of crisis, it would hand one of those shattered men the keys to an empire and act surprised when he behaved like a madman. Ibrahim wasn't born a monster. He was a victim of that system long before he ever committed a single monstrous act. He was a casualty of a machine designed to preserve power at the expense of human sanity. He was broken by his prison and then given the power to make the entire world his prison. And that brings us to the final, tragic act of this story. What happens when the establishment finally decides it's time to put the monster they themselves created out of its misery? What happens when the puppet masters finally cut the last string? The answer tells us everything we need to know about the brutal, unsentimental nature of power. So the establishment has had enough. The Sultan, a man broken by the very system that created him, has become too great a liability to bear. The story of him drowning his harem, whether true or a masterful piece of propaganda, has served its purpose. It has sealed his fate. And so we come to the end of our story, the echo of Ibrahim's tragic reign. What happens when the curtain finally falls, and what is the verdict on this so-called mad sultan? The end was as swift as it was brutal. A fatwa, a legal ruling, was secured from the chief religious official of the empire, declaring the sultan unfit to rule. The elite troops, the janissaries, who had once been loyal to the throne, were now turned against him. They stormed the palace, but this was no chaotic battle. This was a clinical political removal. Ibrahim was seized not as a monarch, but as a prisoner. And in a final devastating act of psychological cruelty, he was thrown back into the one place he thought he had escaped forever. He was locked back inside the Kafes. Can you imagine the horror of that, to be freed from hell after 22 years only to be cast back into its depths? For 10 days he was left there listening to the sounds of the palace moving on without him hearing the cheers for his own 6-year-old son, Mehmed, who had been placed on the throne, the ultimate rejection. And then on August 18, 1648, the executioners came for him. The man who had survived the cage for 2 decades was finally killed in it, strangled with a silk bowstring, the traditional method for executing royalty. The problem of Ibrahim was solved. So, what is our final verdict? This is where the story gets complicated, because in history, as in life, 2 contradictory things can be true at the same time. Was Ibrahim a victim? Absolutely, without question. He was the survivor of a state-sanctioned program of psychological torture. The man who sat on that throne was not a whole person. He was a collection of trauma responses, a walking, breathing case study in severe, untreated PTSD. The paranoia, the rages, the bizarre compulsive behaviors, they were all symptoms of a mind that had been systematically broken. In that sense, he deserves our deepest empathy, the same empathy we would extend to any survivor of profound abuse. But here is the second, much harder truth. Was he also a terrible person? A cruel, selfish, and dangerously incompetent ruler whose actions caused immense suffering. The evidence for that is also overwhelming. His trauma may be an explanation for his behavior, but it is not an excuse for it. The women he terrified in his harem, the officials he capriciously had executed, the people of his empire who suffered under his fiscal mismanagement, they were all victims of his reign regardless of the cause. It's a deeply uncomfortable reality that we grapple with even today. Understanding a person's tragic backstory does not erase the harm they cause. We can feel immense sympathy for the broken child inside the man while still condemning the monstrous actions of the man himself. He was both a victim and a villain. A man who was profoundly wronged, who then went on to do profound wrong. And that is a tragedy almost too heavy to comprehend. But the story doesn't end with Ibrahim's death. The echo of his disastrous reign, the ripple effect, would shape the empire for years to come. Because when you depose a king and put a 6-year-old child in his place, you don't create stability. You create a power vacuum. And nature, especially political nature, abhors a vacuum. What happened next was a brutal multi-year power struggle that makes modern political rivalries look like a friendly school debate. It was a battle for control of the new child sultan, and at its center were the 2 most powerful women in the empire. In one corner we have Ibrahim's mother, the old veteran, the Grand Regent Ottoman Sultan. And in the other corner we have Ibrahim's wife, the mother of the new sultan, the young and ambitious Turhan Sultan. It was a dynastic feud between the new king's mother and grandmother. You could call it the Real Housewives of Topkapi Palace, except instead of throwing wine at each other, they commanded armies and ordered assassinations. This rivalry plunged the government into chaos for years, a period that came to be known as the Sultanate of Women. It was a cold war fought in the corridors of the harem and the chambers of the state council, and it ended as so many of these stories do, in blood. In 1651, fearing she was about to be outmaneuvered and replaced, Ottoman Sultan allegedly planned to depose her young grandson and replace him with another with a more pliable mother. But Turhan Sultan discovered the plot, and she struck first. Ottoman Sultan, the most powerful woman in Ottoman history for nearly half a century, was ambushed in her own quarters and strangled with a curtain. The cycle of violence continued. The chaos Ibrahim left in his wake consumed even his own powerful mother. The very system of paranoia and brutality that had created him and that he had perpetuated ultimately devoured everyone. And that brings us to our final human insight. What does this story, this echo from a cursed chamber, mean for us today? Ibrahim's story is a timeless and terrifying warning. It's a warning about the dangers of unchecked power, yes. But it's also a more subtle and perhaps more important warning about what happens when we as a society fail to understand or address the deep wounds of psychological trauma. We create monsters not through active malice, but through neglect, through fear, and through systems that prioritize power over people. The cursed chamber of this story was never just a room. It was the system. The Kafes was a machine built by fear, designed to produce either corpses or madmen. And for what? To avoid the political inconvenience of a civil war. They chose to sacrifice the sanity of their princes for the stability of their state, and in the end, with Ibrahim, they got neither. He went down in history as Ibrahim the Mad. It's a simple, dismissive label, a convenient shorthand for a profoundly complicated and painful tragedy. It's so much easier to remember a one-dimensional monster than it is to confront the uncomfortable truth that we often have a hand in creating the very monsters we fear. We see a broken person lashing out, and we call them evil because it's simpler than examining the circumstances that broke them. Ibrahim was not a good man, but the story of his life is not a simple tale of good versus evil. It's a story about what happens when you take a shattered soul and give it absolute power. It's a story of a man who never had a chance. And that is the most profound tragedy of all. Thank you for joining us in this particularly cursed chamber. The story of Ibrahim leaves us with a difficult question, one without an easy answer. When you look at his life, do you see a monster, a victim, or a tragic combination of both? Is it even possible to separate the man from the madness that was forced upon him? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. And if you wish to unlock more of history's darkest secrets and most complicated tragedies, be sure to subscribe to Cursed Chambers. The past is always waiting.